Okay, well, thanks. David and I have just been asked to say a few words, as Tom said there, about how this convention fits in with international best practice and about how these sort of things have operated elsewhere. So I won't be doing the kind of speech that you heard in the first half. It's just really a very quick sort of 5-minute introduction into it. And then after that, David will follow with another sort of brief discussion of how they actually worked. So I suppose one of the first things to say is that debates about constitutional reform aren't new. So you've heard about the various times that we've tried it here in the past, the two previous conventions, and obviously it happens all around the world, and nor are constitutional conventions. But what's different over the last decade or so is that there's a second wave going on around the world where instead of these being top-down, elitist-driven projects where you get a bunch of constitutional lawyers together who then emerge with a document and present it to society, more and more now ordinary people are being asked for their views about how the reforms should proceed. And I suppose there's a number of reasons for this. One is the sort of growing disaffection and the growing decline in turnout internationally, not just in Ireland, the growing disconnect between people and politicians. And so this new wave seeks to really garner ordinary people into the process, into decision-making, rather than just once every 4 or 5 years or whenever they're asked to put a mark on a ballot box, to actually increase the participation. So the people here would be expected to go back to their communities and talk to their family, friends, relatives and neighbours about what is going on. So there should be a greater connect through all of you back into society as a whole about how the convention is proceeding. And that's the sort of the logic that's behind these that have gone on all around the world. So to date, there's 5 major examples of these that we're aware of. The first one was in 1998, and then there was a big debate in Australia about whether they should become a republic or stay as with the Queen as head of state. And this was, again, one of these issues. It was very difficult for the politicians to decide. It was very contentious in society. So this is the first time we're aware of where ordinary people were brought in to a convention and debated with politicians about what would happen. So they sat around for maybe about 2 weeks, I think it was, and in February 1998. So the politicians and the people sat side by side there and came to a decision, and it was put to a referendum. So that was the first time that we have the current model that we see here, where there's elected members and ordinary citizens who have been contacted. In the other 3 cases, there was only citizens. Okay, there weren't any elected politicians, and they were the 2 cases in Canada and 1 in the Netherlands. So the 2 in Canada were on electoral reform. The first one was in British Columbia, the state where Vancouver is, over on the Pacific, on the west side of Canada in 2004, and then in Ontario, the state where Toronto is, in 2007, on the eastern part of Canada. And then there was the Dutch Citizens Forum called the Burger Forum in 2006. And again, as I say, what marked these 3 out is that unlike the Australian one, they only had citizens in them. They didn't have any elected representatives. And then maybe one of the problems with that is that there isn't the same buy-in from the political system. So hopefully we've got a great system here where we have elected representatives as well as citizens coming together. So those citizens were selected randomly, as somewhat the way that some of you have been found, and they met at a number of weekends over about 11 months, up to about 11 months in BC, 8 months in Ontario and 9 months in the Netherlands. But they were only discussing electoral reform, so they went into that very, very deeply altogether. The 2 Canadian ones both recommended changes. David will go a little bit more into it, whereas the Dutch ones were, after considering it over 8 months, they decided they were happy with the status quo after all. They just made some technical changes. So, these things don't always result in huge change, it decides. And then the last one was the 2007 Icelandic Constitutional Council. And again, that involved ordinary citizens, but they put themselves forward for election. So they weren't randomly picked citizens. They were people who put themselves forward for election. And of course, that was after, a very intense breakdown of the Icelandic economy and governance and so on. And they sat for 4 months and basically came up with an entirely new constitution, which was voted on by the people and accepted. But it was only guidance, so it hasn't actually taken into effect. We have to wait to see what the Icelandic government is going to, or what the Icelandic Parliament is going to do with it next. But really, this, where we are here now, it bears some similarity to the Australian one in terms of mixing ordinary citizens and professional politicians. The decision to select the citizen members at random rather than by election, and to try to operate it along deliberative lines. So not so much debating as deliberating, which David will go into a little bit now, puts it more into the context of what happened in Canada and in Holland. So I'll pass you over to David, who will talk to some of that detail.
Thanks, Jane. As Jane has said, constitutional conventions like the one we have here share in common the fact that citizens are at the heart of the process as members working side by side, in our case, with elected politicians. So that's the bit of the story that Jane was wanting to tell you about. The other main thing they share in common, though, is how they operate, and that's the bit that I want to talk to you for a few minutes about. And in the way in which they operate is really quite different to what might be familiar to many of us from other contexts. So the emphasis is very much on deliberation, on dialogue, rather than on formal debate, on standing on principle. And this is referred to as deliberation in practice. So the idea is that there should be an understanding that members treat each other with mutual respect, which is something that the Chair was talking about a bit earlier on. Mutual respect, listening respectively to the views and arguments of other members, becoming informed about the various arguments on the issue, and on occasions being prepared to change minds on particular issues. So I suppose to summarise it, it's shirt sleeves, flip charts and dialogue around the table rather than formal dress and procedural debates in parliamentary chambers. In other words, it's very different style to what we're even having now today. It will be very different when you meet again in January to what you're experiencing right now. And so let me just spend a little bit of time talking to you about how these conventions that Jane has mentioned to you have operated. I have the good fortune of having been involved in 3 of them myself, so I've witnessed this in action in other places. First, the convention members receive briefing documents produced by relevant experts. These could be briefing documents by advocates on either side of the issue, or they could indeed be academic experts. It could be a bit of a mix of those things. And the idea of the briefing documents is to set out the issues at hand, to give both sides of the relevant argument. There might be more than 2 sides, there might be a number of sides to the particular argument. And at all times to present the argument in a way that the other side sees as being a fair representation of the views. So the experts themselves are talking to each other in advance. And these briefing documents are circulated to all the members in advance. It could be a couple of days in advance to give the members an opportunity to read the briefing documents and assimilate the contents. And then the way in which the conventions are set up, and you'll see the photograph above me there, I think, to get a sense of it, is that the members are arranged in small groups, usually at tables of about 8, with a facilitator, a trained facilitator at each table, and a note taker at each table. And the role of the facilitator is literally to facilitate. It's to make sure that the discussion, the deliberation and the dialogue at that table proceeds in the way that one would hope it would. So it's to ensure that the discussion stays on the agenda, to ensure that the members are given an equal chance to speak and express their views. So when the convention meets to discuss an issue, let's imagine in January the issue at hand will be whether to reduce the voting age to 17, one of the first items to discuss. The first stage then will involve a plenary session of the full members, if this is to follow the way in which conventions like this have operated in the past, with brief presentations by the experts based on the briefing documents that will have been circulated in advance. The experts then stay on hand to answer questions of fact, just to make sure that all the members of the convention are satisfied that they've got a good sense of the arguments on both sides. And at that point, the experts leave the stage. They literally leave the room. So the role of the experts is to provide expert witness. They are not involved as members of the convention. What follows then generally is small group discussions. This is why the members are at tables of 8, as I said. The objective there is to allow time for the convention members, all of the members, to have an opportunity to discuss and have a deliberative debate and dialogue about the particular issues before them in an atmosphere of mutual respect and hearing the views of others at the table. The discussions can continue like this for some time, and the convention itself, I'm sure, will have a lot to say about how they would like that agenda to run. But usually what you'll tend to find is there's a mix of plenary discussions where the members are able to hear what members at other tables are saying, and small group discussions to give a time for detailed discussion around the table itself. So the ultimate objective is to arrive at an agreed recommendation. That can be by consensus, which I'm sure could happen on occasions, but it could also be by vote. There isn't a need always to arrive at consensus. And I think it's important to note that there's various outcomes that are possible here, and Jane's already made some mention of this. It's possible, like in the Dutch case, that on the particular issue at hand, the convention members decide this is okay. We don't actually see the need to change anything on this matter. And that's the end of the discussion on that. It's perfectly possible. Obviously, it's possible for the exact opposite, for the convention members to decide we're going for a radical change, a completely new electoral system, or reducing the voting age, or any of the other issues that you're dealing with, that we're actually going to make that particular step. Or it's possible for something in between, that it's a little tweak here, a little tweak there. So I think it's important to sort of make that point that the convention is here to have a debate and a discussion about the issues. It isn't per se necessarily here to propose change in each and every case. The question then is what will happen next? And in this case we know, and we heard again from the Taoiseach earlier on, that the government has made a commitment to provide a formal response to recommendations by the convention within 4 months. And I think it's important to note that fact, because as your discussions are ongoing, you should already be expecting to receive formal responses from the government to the matters that you discussed earlier in your proceedings, because you're going to be here for a whole year and involved in this process. So I think what this means in practice is that you should expect to get responses from the government as this unfolds. Anyway, all of this kicks off in January at your first meeting. And I just want to finish by saying, marking the point that the Irish Constitutional Convention joins a very small band of other cases that are aimed at giving citizens a real voice in discussing big questions about the Constitution. This is an historic moment, as others have been saying. Nothing like this has been tried before on this island or on any of these islands. People like me who research in this area, Jane and myself, can only hope that you succeed in your work, and in particular that you can prove that this country, to the country and to the wider world, that deliberative processes like this, constitutional conventions like this, can matter. I know you're going to have a huge audience. You already have a huge audience on the internet for today's proceedings. So a lot hangs on the success of this, and all I can do is wish you all the best in your endeavours. Thank you.